So our series on Jonathan has now come to that amazing time when he forges a special friendship, a special bond with David. And the strength and the specialness of this friendship is captured in our title for this morning. He loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan and David's friendship provides us a wonderful example of love between brethren. And it gives us a model of what ecclesial life could and even should be like. As brothers and sisters, we interact together, striving to work together on the journey of life. And not only that, the relationship of Jonathan and David takes us into the kingdom age itself. And it gives us a picture of the closeness, the bond between brothers and sisters in the kingdom age, which we'll share, God willing, as we work together for God's glory for eternity. Now, coming to 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan and David are probably seen and known of each other before 1 Samuel 18, but their friendship only really develops when we come to this chapter. It comes after the events of 1 Samuel 17, David defeating Goliath. And after that moment, we read 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, "And it came to pass, when he, that is David, had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword and to his bow and to his girdle." And so those verses tell us of that moment when this friendship is initiated, and strong and emphatic terms are used. Soul is used, knit, covenant in verse 3, love. Notice also that it's Jonathan is the one who is leading, initiating, making the move to establish and form this friendship with David. Now, these words in verse 1 to 4 are actually quite amazing, because this friendship of Jonathan and David was an unlikely friendship. There's actually quite a few differences between Jonathan and David, which we'll briefly go through now. They were from a different family heritage. Jonathan from the tribe of Benjamin, prominent family, lived in Gibeah, the ruling city where Saul was based. David, different tribe of Judah, from an obscure, insignificant family, from little Bethlehem, as we know from Micah 5 verse 2. Well, there were different ages. Jonathan was about 35 to 40 at this time. David was less than 20. And we're not going to go into the chronology. I've got a very raw spreadsheet which puts the chronology into some sort of an order. If you want that later, that's fine. I can send it to you. But this age difference between Jonathan and David was about 20 years, which is quite significant. Well, they were of different position and status. Jonathan, the eldest son of the king, he was the crown prince. He was the next king in waiting. As such, he would have been rich, he had possessions, he would have been served by many servants, all looking after him. We've seen from 1 Samuel 13, he was a commander in the army. Contrast that to David. David wasn't the first son, or the second, or the third. He was the 8th son of Jesse, way down the order. He was forgotten in 1 Samuel 16. He was left out in the field, just a lowly shepherd looking after those few little sheep. He was poor, little possessions. He's called a servant several times in this record, servant to Saul. In 1 Samuel 17, he's too young for the army. He's just coming there to bring a few supplies to his brothers. Well, finally, they had different weapons. Jonathan, the best weapons in Israel. He had one of 2 swords, although at this point of time, from plundering the Philistines, there would have been many more swords in Israel. But he had one of those 2 swords in 1 Samuel 13. He was skilled in the bow. David, no formal weapon training at all. No sword, no bow, no armor. All he had was a sling and a staff. So there were many differences between these 2 men. So from a human perspective, from a human point of view, it was unlikely that these 2 men would form this special friendship in 1 Samuel 18. And these things down through the ages have been a barrier between people from different echelons of society. But these differences did not affect Jonathan, and especially Jonathan and David's relationship together. These things really don't matter. They're not the essence of the person. Jonathan and David couldn't control any of these things. They're not matters of heart and mind. What really matters is what people are like on the inside, their internal, their outlook, their attitude. So despite these differences of heritage, position, status, Jonathan knew that he and David in 1 Samuel 18, in these first few verses, they were one, focused on the same things, they loved the same things, they were both going in the same direction. And in that there's a lesson for us. Jonathan in particular, he didn't allow his position, his status, what he had, his riches, his possession, get in the way of a godly, spiritual relationship with David. And for ourselves, we're all one in Christ. From different backgrounds, ages, nations, doesn't matter in Christ. We're all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3, verse 28. All aiming for the same things, same focus, journeying together towards the kingdom. Now, in material terms, Jonathan had everything to lose in making this friendship with David. And he did. He lost his status. He lost his position. He was never king of the nation. But that didn't worry him. His mind was on higher things, on greater things. So 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, the last phrase of that verse tells us Jonathan loved David as his own soul. Others loved David in the nation too. Come to chapter 18, verse 16. Chapter 18, verse 16 of 1 Samuel says, "But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them." Verse 20, someone else who loved David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Also in verse 22, the servants loved David, the servants of Saul. But their love was based on external things. And we see that especially from verse 16. They were impressed with David's valor, his skill, his human prowess, as they saw David come in and go out before them. Jonathan's love, back in chapter 18, verse 1, was much greater than that. Jonathan's love of David was based on higher, spiritual, godly things. Now, back in 18 verse 1, we're also told the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Now, at what point did that occur? When was Jonathan's soul knit with David? Well, we'll just show in a moment. I believe Jonathan was there in the valley of Elah when David defeated Goliath. Was Jonathan's soul knit together with David at the point of David killing Goliath with the sling and the stone, cutting off the head of the giant? Was it at that point, after that amazing act of valor and courage, Jonathan's soul was knit together with David? And it wasn't. It wasn't at that point of David killing Goliath with that stone. In fact, verse 1 of chapter 18 is very specific when Jonathan felt that way about David, and also why. It was in verse 1 when David had made an end of speaking to Saul. It was after what David said. It was the words of David which give a window into the heart of man, which is where Jonathan saw the soul, the attitude, the thinking, the outlook of David, what David was really like. He saw David's humility by what David said. His respect, his faith, his desire for God was expressed in the way that he spoke to Saul. And that, at that moment, was when Jonathan's soul was knit together with the soul of David. So Jonathan didn't love David just because David was a fearless, great warrior, skilled with a sling, having that raw courage. And it was impressive, but this friendship was not based on human strength or human prowess or human greatness. Their friendship rather was based on the strength of God and godly values and godly character, especially seen in the words that David spoke. So verse 1 of chapter 18 was when Jonathan's soul was knit together with David. Let's look in more detail at why. Why was Jonathan's soul knit together with the soul of David? Why does Jonathan go to such an extent? Well, true friendships need a proper foundation, a proper basis. Jonathan had to get to know David and vice versa. And the answer to why Jonathan goes to such an extent to form this special friendship with David is to read 1 Samuel 17 through the eyes of Jonathan. Now, Jonathan isn't mentioned in 1 Samuel 17, and yet we believe he was there. And there's three reasons we have for saying that. The first is, we know that Jonathan heard the words of David at the end of 1 Samuel 17, when David was speaking to Saul. And that's when 1 Samuel 18 verse 1 occurs. So Jonathan was there in the aftermath of the battle, probably in the battle as well. Second reason, we're going to look at this later on, chapter 19 verse 5, Jonathan gives an eyewitness account of what happened when David killed Goliath. Chapter 19 verse 5. Third reason, Jonathan, we know from 1 Samuel 13, was a commander in Saul's army. So it makes sense he was there in 1 Samuel 17 with the people of Israel ready to face the Philistines. So he was there observing events, and that was how he got to know this young shepherd boy, David. Now we all know the story of 1 Samuel 17. It's not a normal battle. Instead of two armies engaging, a giant comes out. Goliath presents himself as impressive sight, polished brass gleaming in the sunlight, brandishing massive weapons, issuing a fearsome challenge. Come to 1 Samuel 17, verse 11, Israel's reaction. First Samuel 17, verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, Goliath, the giant, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Israel's reaction, one of fear, dread, dismay. How would they ever defeat such a champion? Did that reaction in verse 11 include Jonathan? We're not told Jonathan's reaction here, but we've already seen his amazing faith in 1 Samuel 14. In the face of overwhelming numbers of the Philistines, Jonathan's response to his armor bearer was, come on, what are we waiting for? Let's go and get them. Let's go up to these uncircumcised Philistines. Jonathan already has taken on thousands of Philistines. He's ready. He's prepared to do that. What was Goliath compared to thousands of Philistines? And I don't think Jonathan would have been dismayed or greatly afraid in verse 11. His faith cast out fear. Jonathan would have believed God could have helped them to overcome Goliath. Well, 1 Samuel 17, verse 10, Goliath there issues a challenge. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And so Goliath calls, come on, I want a man. No one in Israel stepped forward. Saul was the obvious choice. He wasn't prepared to take Goliath on. Who was the next obvious choice to take Goliath on? And it would have been Jonathan, the crown prince, the heir. Did Jonathan have the faith to take Goliath on? And I believe he did. We've seen that already from 1 Samuel 14. But he doesn't take Goliath on. In fact, he's not even mentioned in 1 Samuel 17. So why doesn't Jonathan fight Goliath? And we don't know the definitive reasons why he doesn't take on Goliath, but here are four possibilities. Jonathan couldn't upstage his father Saul again. He's already done that twice already. 1 Samuel 13, verse 3, that initial incursion, it was Jonathan who took the Philistines on there. 1 Samuel 14, he's acted outside his father's command, in secret, going up to the Philistines. He couldn't do it again. Perhaps Saul may have forbidden Jonathan to take on Goliath. He wouldn't want his firstborn son, the heir to the king, the throne, to risk his life in such a suicidal way. Well, perhaps Jonathan in 1 Samuel 17 could well have asked for a sign. We know that he asked for a sign from God in 1 Samuel 14, which way God wanted to direct him. Should he put himself forward and face this giant? But there would have been no indication from God for Jonathan to do that, to take on that challenge. But it also could be more than that. And what Jonathan knew at this time is very significant. Jonathan knew from 1 Samuel 13, verse 14, that Saul's line, including himself, would no longer rule over the nation. And also from 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, Jonathan would have known that Saul himself had been rejected by God for his disobedience. And in both those passages, Samuel had said another king was coming, a king chosen by God. It will be a man after God's own heart. It will be a neighbor, someone in the nations who was better than Saul. Well, who was that person? And how would he be revealed to the nation? And Jonathan doesn't know, but he was alert. He was waiting expectantly for this man after God's own heart, the next king, to be revealed. And so Jonathan held back and did nothing. He came to realize it wasn't his role to take on this giant. It would have been difficult for him. Uncharacteristically, Jonathan does nothing, doesn't act, as Goliath issued his proud challenge day after day for 40 days, and after which David comes along to the battle. So when David comes to the battle, what did Jonathan see in this young shepherd boy? Well, this is what Jonathan would have seen as he was there in the background observing events. He saw in David a man who desired action. Whilst everyone else in verse 11 was cowering in fear, running away, it's too difficult in that negative spiral. David wasn't paralyzed by fear. He was self-motivated to act. And we see that from 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. In verse 26, we read these words. David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that kills the Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David wasn't prepared to stand back and do nothing. He wanted action. He wanted something to be done. Well, who's going to do these things? Well, Jonathan saw in David a man with a willing spirit who offers himself. Chapter 17, verse 32. David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Jonathan very likely was right next to Saul as David said those words. And Jonathan would have heard David's offer for himself to go and fight this giant. David was ready and willing to lay down his life if need be, to sacrifice himself for the benefit of others. Jonathan sees what David's view of the enemy was. 1 Samuel 17, verse 36, where David says these words, Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David wants these uncircumcised Philistines destroyed, especially this Philistine Goliath, who defied God. So David didn't look to the size or the strength of the enemy. He saw Goliath and the Philistines as outside the covenant of God. He saw them as God saw them. What about David's view of God? Well, Jonathan would have seen that God was very real in David's life. God is powerful and living. Jonathan would have seen David go down to meet this Philistine, unprotected, only armed with staff and sling. And what a picture, so unbalanced and biased in favor of Goliath. And then Jonathan and all Israel would have heard the words of David ring out in that natural amphitheater of the valley of Elah in verse 45. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will Yahweh deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and all this assembly shall know that Yahweh saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands. Well, how could David defeat Goliath? Humanly impossible, yet David's view of God can do anything. He would help in even the most difficult circumstance against the strongest of foes. God would protect him. God would look after him. And so these words show the strong faith of David, trusted implicitly, positively in these verses in God's salvation. God was able to deliver, not only from Goliath, but notice in verse 46, from the whole host of the Philistines that day. No doubts in there at all, which were vindicated because next few verses, the giant fell down dead. Well, a final point on this overhead. What was David's aim? What was his motive in doing all this? Why did he do it? And clearly, from verse 45 and verse 46, it wasn't for his own self-glory or his own greatness or his own grandeur. It was so that God might be glorified, for his name to be known amongst all the earth, and also for the benefit of others, for deliverance of Israel. And Jonathan, standing back there, observing events, would have seen all this and come to know this lowly shepherd boy for what he was. And all that formed a basis for Jonathan's friendship with David, because Jonathan, in effect, was effectively the same caliber, the same sort of person as David. And we know that from what we've seen in 1 Samuel 14. Both Jonathan and David had the same desire for action. Both had the same willing spirit. Both had the same view of the enemy. Both had the same view of God. Both had that same strong faith. Both had the same aim and the motive, why they did what they did. That was the basis of their spiritual relationship in 1 Samuel 18, verse 1 to 4. Sharing the same spiritual values, having the same godly focus. Now come to 1 Samuel 17 and verse 57, the aftermath of the battle. So 1 Samuel 17 verse 57, David's now before Saul with the head of Goliath in his hand. And verse 57 tells us, and as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered and said, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. So David humbly reports to the king his family, showing great respect. He tells King Saul where he's from. He tells him the town where he's from, which was, at the end of verse 58, Bethlehem, which was a town of Judah. A town of Judah, Genesis 49 verse 10, the scepter of rule and power shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. Did Jonathan know those words of Genesis 49 verse 10? Quite possibly, because there's every indication, 1 Samuel 18 verse 1 to 4, that he knew David was the one, the chosen one of God, to lead the nation, the man after God's own heart, the next king of Israel. And Jonathan fully supported and endorsed that choice, because after all that, we read in verse 1, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Then in verse 3, Jonathan and David made a covenant together. I'm just going to leave a question hanging. What did they say together? Were they the same words that they promised together? What were the terms of this covenant? And I'm just going to leave that question hanging. And then verse 4, Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, gave it to David and his garments, even to his sword, to his bow, and to his girdle. What is Jonathan doing in verse 4? Why does he give David his robe? Why does he give David his garments, his precious sword, his bow, which he was skilled in? And all those things are symbols of Jonathan's royal position. His robe would have been readily recognizable as the prince's robe, the heir to the throne. He willingly, in verse 4, gives it to David. He gives to David his garments, and it's the same word, armor, which is used in 1 Samuel 17, verse 38. Saul tries to give David his armor. David takes it off, doesn't want it. The words, it's probably not metallic armor, but some sort of material sort of armor. David rejected the armor of Saul, but he accepts the garments, the armor of Jonathan. Well, there are only two swords in Israel in 1 Samuel 13, and this is one of them in verse 4. Jonathan readily gives it to David, as he does with his precious bow. Jonathan in verse 4 is giving the symbols of his royal office, what he stood for as prince, to David, and he does it willingly. And in doing that, he's recognizing David is the rightful heir to the throne, the man after God's own heart. He's abdicating his position as heir to the throne, giving it to David. And Jonathan humbly accepts the will of God, so that even though he himself loses everything in regard to his position and status, yet he realizes this was the one. And Jonathan would gladly work with that one to nurture, to mentor, to guide David, to make that transition of kingship as smooth as possible. And the words of John the Baptist from John 3 verse 30 come to mind. He must increase, but I must decrease. And those words capture the spirit that Jonathan is showing in these verses. So this friendship was forged at a positive time in Israel. The great enemy of the Philistines, Goliath, and all the host there was defeated. Those good times were not to last, because the rest of 1 Samuel 18 shows the changing attitude of Saul to David, Saul's burning jealousy, which raged so furiously. When we come to 1 Samuel 19, he wants to kill David. It was bad, it was dark times. Well, how would Jonathan react to this? Would his friendship with David be affected in some way? Well, Jonathan now in 1 Samuel 19 verse 1 to 7 shows a shining example of a true friend. A friend not only in good times when things are going well, positive, things are on the up, but also when things are really, really bad, really difficult. Jonathan was true to his covenant, his promise. He stood up for what was right. And he goes here in 1 Samuel 19 to great lengths to protect, support David. Jonathan actually was successful in 1 Samuel 19, verse 1 to 7. He actually achieves a positive outcome. At the end of this section in verse 7, David was reconciled to Saul, peace was achieved. So what we're going to do now is to look how Jonathan approaches the situation in 1 Samuel 19. How is a true friend to David, how does he deal with this difficult situation? Well, 1 Samuel 19, verse 1. Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. So here we have Saul's fault. His sin, his trespass is told to us. And it was absolutely wrong. Saul wanted to kill innocent blood. It's not good, it's not godly at all. And it's very sad that Saul the king should feel this way to one of his most outstanding subjects. And it was all fueled by jealousy. Jealousy filled Saul's mind to such an extent that he couldn't stand David, couldn't see any good in him at all. But nothing was further from the truth, because David behaved himself very wisely, and we're told that time and time again in 1 Samuel 18. For example, verse 5 of 1 Samuel 18, David went out whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. There was nothing wrong with what David did. Verse 14, we're told the same words. David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, that Yahweh was with him. 1 Samuel 18, verse 30, we're told there again, David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. So in other words, despite David leading Saul's army out on these successful victories over the enemy, David didn't push himself up. He didn't bask in any glory of his victories. David was totally humble. And yet, Saul's jealousy in 1 Samuel 19, verse 1, was so much, he openly tells Jonathan and all his servants to get rid of David, kill him. How can someone like that be won back? It's seemingly impossible. Surely the best advice that Jonathan can give, David, you're in trouble, get out of here, run away. But Jonathan doesn't. He doesn't give that advice at all. Jonathan wasn't that sort of character. Jonathan would try in every way possible to seek for reconciliation, for peace, for a solution. And he earnestly stands up for what is right. and actively seeks for a solution to this really difficult problem. And many times in the record we find Jonathan doing that, standing next to his father, trying to guide his father, reasoning, pleading, seeking to help his father back on that right path. He wouldn't give up, and here's no exception. Now, Jonathan in verse 1 doesn't attempt to remonstrate with Saul, his father, in front of all Saul's servants. So he doesn't stand up to his father in verse 1 and say, "You're wrong, Saul, you shouldn't be doing it." And he does that for a very good reason, because it would be very hard for Saul to back down in front of all those people from his evil intent. It would take a lot for Saul to swallow his pride in front of all his servants. Thought was required as to the best way to handle the situation. So verse 2 to 3, Jonathan formulates a plan of action. Verse 2, "But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, seeks to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself till the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee, and what I see, that will I tell thee." And so the first point is that Jonathan took immediate action. Immediate action was required. David's life in serious danger. Jonathan goes out in verse 2 and tells David. Doesn't leave it to anyone else. Doesn't send a messenger. He goes himself and tells David. "It's really bad news, David. Saul, my father, seeks to kill thee." And in that phrase, Jonathan doesn't soften the seriousness of the situation. He was prepared to tell David straight. This was vital. This was serious. David, your life is in serious danger, grave danger. Doesn't attempt to play it down, but lays it out plainly. Now, sometimes the temptation for ourselves, when we give some bad or vital or serious news, negative news, sometimes the temptation is there to downplay it, and also just to leave it there. I've done my bit. I've told someone the problem, and it's up to that person to now come up with a plan themselves. Not Jonathan. There's an emphasis in verse 2 which we need to bring out, where Jonathan says, "Saul, my father, seeks to kill thee. Now, therefore, I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide thyself in a secret place and hide thyself." Now, therefore. It's not just give this serious, bad, vital news and leave it there and do nothing. Jonathan has a plan of action, which is actually quite detailed in the last half of verse 2 and in verse 3. So despite this serious news, despite this grave, this vital news, despite this grave danger of the situation, there was something that could be done. And it's obvious Jonathan has worked it all through in his mind. He's thought about the situation. He provides a positive solution to resolve it. And so when we tell others about vital, serious news, brothers, sisters, young person, friends, whoever it is, let's not forget to attach a now, therefore, a positive, upbuilding solution to resolve it. Now let's have a look at Jonathan's plan of action. It involved good sound advice for David in verse 2 to go and hide himself, to keep out the way, but it also involved effort on Jonathan's part. Jonathan volunteered himself to go and speak to Saul to try and change his mind. And that wasn't going to be easy. The king had spoken in verse 1. The king's command, instruction was, kill David. And so for Jonathan to go and try and change Saul's mind, it involved some sort of risk to persuade his father otherwise. He didn't know what the reaction of his father would be. He didn't know if a javelin was going to be whistling towards him. But Jonathan was willing to offer himself to go out, speak to the king. He was a willing volunteer, a necessary volunteer for the sake of peace. And again, there's a lesson in that for ourselves. It's so easy sometimes to leave it to someone else, someone better than ourselves, more suited to the task, to assist, to work through challenging situations, to talk to interested friends. And there's a good lesson here from Jonathan. Be prepared to be like Jonathan, to go and do, to be an active, willing volunteer in whatever situation. Now, we want to notice in verse 3 specifically how Jonathan would go and do it. He would go out in verse 3 and stand beside his father. And that gives us a clue how he's going to approach this difficult task. He wouldn't stand in front of his father. He wouldn't stand from a distance and shout to his father. He wouldn't tell his father what a fool he was. He wouldn't berate him. It would just be him and his father, and he would stand alongside to him. He would stand next to him. And that is the best way to appeal to someone's heart. As in Matthew chapter 18, just you two, go and tell them their fault. Alongside, not above others, not in front of them, not better than them, rather next to them. To put your arm around them and assist them back on the path of righteousness. Also notice in verse 3 that word commune. I will commune with my Father of thee. That tells us the method in which Jonathan is going to speak to his father. It will be a gentle way. Wouldn't be provocative or angry. It will be the quiet voice of gentle yet powerful reason. So now Jonathan in verse 4 to 5 carries out this plan of action. As he appeals to his father in person. So verse 4. Jonathan spoke good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, let not the king sin against his servant against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee ward very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistine, and Yahweh wrought a great salvation for all Israel. And thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? And these are powerful, well-chosen words that Jonathan uses in his appeal to Saul as he now promotes the good of David to his father. Notice in these words, Jonathan mentions Saul's sin twice. He doesn't soften the blow to the king. He doesn't soften the terrible thing that the king wanted to do. It was sin, it was iniquity, and Saul, his father, had to come face to face with that. God wasn't happy with such an evil intent. But Jonathan doesn't leave it there either. He doesn't say to Saul, you're a sinner, you're going to perish, that's it. There was a way of escape. There was opportunity. And so he appeals to his father to repent. And this is when our word of the day comes in. He says in verse 4, let not the king sin against his servants. It's not a command. It's not an instruction. Rather, it's an appeal for Saul himself to choose to change his own course of action. Let not the king sin against David. In the end, Saul had to come to terms with this himself. He couldn't be forced or coerced into it, because forcing someone into repentance isn't true repentance. It doesn't come from them. It doesn't come from their heart, but an appeal, a passionate appeal of let not, can strike deep at their heart to provoke them to choose to change their ways. Well, notice how Jonathan refers to David in these verses. He refers to David in verse 4 as the king's servant. Let not the king sin against his servant. So Jonathan, in these words, reminds Saul that David is Saul's servant. He points out David is willing to serve King Saul, to look on him as king. That's how David saw it. David doesn't aspire greatness himself. He doesn't aspire to be ruler or king. He's not pushing himself up. Rather, he's a loyal subject. Well, then Jonathan gives a series of reasons in verse 4 and 5 why Saul should relent and not kill David. The first is in verse 4. It's because David has done no wrong to Saul. He has not sinned against him. But then at the end of verse 4, Jonathan goes further than that. It's not only that David hasn't done any wrong against Saul, it's David has actually done a lot of good for Saul. Then in verse 5, Jonathan reminds Saul of a specific example of that good that David has done for him, not only for Saul, but for the whole nation. David in verse 5 risked his life for Saul and Israel when he went against Goliath and took Goliath out. And in verse 5, Jonathan then tries to restore the balance in Saul's mind as he brings God into focus. He reminds Saul of the effect of David's action, that God has wrought a great salvation for all Israel. So these are very well thought out words of Jonathan, presented in a non-provocative way. He emphasizes the seriousness of the situation and yet provides point after point why David should relent, not kill Saul. Saul should relent and not kill David. Saul had no basis whatever to dispose of David. And so these were strong, compelling words which Jonathan says, designed to get to the very heart of the hardened king. Now we just want to look at a couple of these points in more detail. And one of them is that phrase in 19 verse 5, which Saul himself had used in his earlier days. The phrase is, in verse 5, Yahweh wrought a great salvation for all Israel. So here it's used in the context of David slaying Goliath, but these are words of Saul himself in chapter 11 of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 11. Incident comes early on in the reign of Saul, after he's defeated Nahash and the Ammonites, a great victory. The Ammonites were threatening one of the towns of Israel, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. And in 1 Samuel 11 and verse 13, Saul said, "There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today Yahweh hath wrought salvation in Israel." And those were the good words, the correct words, the sincere words of Saul at that time, which no doubt Jonathan heard himself, standing right near his father at that moment. Yahweh had worked through the actions of Saul and Samuel and the nation of Israel to provide that victory there in 1 Samuel 11, and it benefited the whole nation. That's how Saul saw it then. He didn't see the battle, 1 Samuel 11, for his own glory, for puffing himself up. It was for God's glory, it was God at work. The trouble was, though, that attitude of Saul changed. 1 Samuel 18 and 19. Saul now viewed David's victories as competition. Saul doesn't see those victories of David as victories of God providing salvation for Israel. He thinks it's for David's glory, but Saul wanted it for his own glory. Saul wanted to be seen as high. Saul wanted to be respected as a worthy leader amongst all the people. And so Jonathan in 1 Samuel 19 verse 5, when he uses that phrase, Yahweh wrought a great salvation in Israel, for all Israel, he seeks to remind Saul of that moment earlier on in Saul's reign, to rekindle that focus that really it's not to do with man's glory, it's all to do with God's glory. That's what really matters. Think, Saul, back to the time when you had that correct focus. Well, there's something else in verse 5, which Jonathan seeks to remind Saul of. And that is Saul's feelings when the Philistine giant Goliath was slain. And Jonathan probably was standing right next to Saul when David went out and slew Goliath. And we can get a little insight into the reaction of Israel and Saul at that point in chapter 19, verse 5. And it's in the words, "Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice." And this is Jonathan's eyewitness account of what happened with David and Goliath. They saw David, unprotected, walk out, go and take on Goliath. No sword, so young, experienced in warfare. But when the stone hit Goliath on the head, the whole nation of Israel erupted in tremendous joy and rejoicing in Israel. And at that moment, Jonathan looked at his father Saul and saw that Saul was absolutely thrilled. Jonathan never forgot that moment, the joy, the gladness, the rejoicing in Saul's face at that point. Jonathan never forgot that moment. But the trouble was, at this time, Saul had forgotten that moment. He had forgotten that victory. He had forgotten the thrill of that time when that great giant fell. He had forgotten that David risked his life to kill that giant. Saul forgot to refresh his mind in it. He hadn't relived it, to keep it there. And so Jonathan, in chapter 19, verse 5, appeals to his father, think back to that time, 1 Samuel 17. Think back to that moment. Refresh yourself in that moment and in that feelings. And how quickly human beings forget, and for ourselves, how necessary it is to refresh ourselves in things of God and God's victory for us, especially in his Son. Well, Saul's response is given in chapter 19, verse 6 of 1 Samuel 19. And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, as Yahweh lives, he shall not be slain. Saul, he realizes he's been brought face to face with the terribleness of his evil intent, and now he relents in verse 6. And it's actually very strong, because Saul there swears an oath, as Yahweh lives, David won't be slain. And Jonathan accepted that. He really believed his father had changed at that moment in time, that his father had truly repented. He was not going to kill David. He was prepared to see good in his father. He accepted it. And yet, how little that vow really meant to Saul, because not long after, in fact, verse 8, Saul's back again, seeking David's life. But for the moment, Saul had meant it, but it didn't last long. Jonathan's efforts of reconciliation halted only temporarily the madness of this king. But nevertheless, at this moment of time, the present crisis was finished, was past. And in verse 7, Jonathan called to David, and Jonathan showed him all these things, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And perhaps it would have been difficult for David to integrate back into the normal court of the king, but Jonathan was there, helping him, guiding him, nurturing him, mentoring him. What a friend Jonathan was. And wouldn't we all want a friend like that, so that when challenges come, the crises, difficulties, the ups and downs of life, we can lean on someone like that to go out their way to help us. But there's another point as well, and that is we need to be a friend like Jonathan for others, to try as best as we can to put time, effort, energy, activity into helping our brothers, our sisters, young people, our friends through all the burdens, through all the challenges of life that it brings before us. And so let's finish with a few lessons. We can learn from Jonathan about true friendship based on God and his word and his principles as the foundation. We can learn from Jonathan to esteem others better than self. Jonathan so willingly gave up his position, gave up everything materially for David, esteeming David far, far better than himself. And in that we can learn from his utter humility. We can learn what it means to be a true friend, supporting, helping, trying every avenue to work out for a solution, encouraging others. We can learn how to restore in love and meekness, as Jonathan does for his father. Galatians 6 verse 1. Finally, we can learn about being a peacemaker, actively seeking for peace, seeking for reconciliation, seeking for a solution to help people through the challenges and burdens of life. As the Lord Jesus Christ says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God.